Welcome everyone to the DaSy Webinar, preparing for your next virtual stakeholder meeting. My name is Jennifer Dale from the DaSy Center, and I'm here to introduce my colleagues, Tony Ruggiero and Andrea Schambacher, who are going to be walking us through the presentation today. We are going to be meeting from 12:30 until 2 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. We anticipate about 60 minutes of content and Q&A, and then we are going to be offering an additional 30 minutes of optional time if you have some more specific individualized questions that you'd like to ask either of our presenters. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Andrea and Tony for the presentation.
Great, thank you, Jen. And we'll start. We have a poll for you, and we're going to ask where you live in terms of which region in the United States or outside of the US, and what is your role? And Renee, how are we looking on responses?
We have about 30 so far. So about 73% of participants.
Okay, we'll just give it a few more seconds. I think we're good. Can we see the results, please? Okay, so we have West Coast and Northern USA at 28%, outside of the US, 6%. And we have South and East Coast at 19%. So we have people from all over the country, which is excellent. As far as roles, we have a lot of different roles covered as well. 19% are Part C coordinators. We have 16% as Part C data managers, 19% for Part B 619 data managers. Other staff is at 22%. We have some DaSy providers on as well. Thank you very much, Renee, and thank you everyone for getting us started. So before we move any further, we have some housekeeping items. As you can see, we always like to list our Zoom link along with the phone number, meeting ID, and password. And also want to check to make sure everyone can see and hear me. So with nod or thumbs up will suffice. Excellent, thank you. As far as our session today, we do have a few more poll questions for you along the way. Please put any questions you may have during the presentation into the chat, and questions will be answered at the end of the presentation. And with that, I will turn it over to Andrea.
Thank you so much, Tony. And as you can see, the big question for the day is, are you ready? So Renee, I'm going to ask that you launch that second poll. And we want to know, how comfortable are you with hosting and facilitating a virtual stakeholder meeting at this point in time? I'll give everybody a couple of minutes, actually seconds. Just let us know how you feel.
We have about 35 responded so far, about 63%.
Give it another 5 seconds and see where we are. How's that looking, Renee?
I think we've stalled at 40. So, all right,
Can you share the results out? Okay. It looks like we have about 20% of us that are not comfortable at all, and 65% of us that are somewhat comfortable. And it's very understandable because this is a really new way of operating. We do have 15% of you who feel really comfortable with hosting and facilitating a virtual stakeholder meeting. So that's wonderful. As you can see, we all joined this webinar with different perspectives and different experiences, all of those leading to our varying levels of comfort when we're talking about engaging and facilitating stakeholder meetings online. So thank you, Renee, for the poll. We can close that. And I just want to speak to this slide for another minute. Benjamin Franklin once said that by failing to prepare, you are preparing to fail. And as you see in this cartoon, our new remote work environment, it requires that we all learn how to facilitate effective virtual meetings, but it requires a different mindset and often a different skill set, as well as additional steps for preparation. And so before the world of remote work, we were all able to just prepare our materials and show up at our event, whether it was at a conference room or a local jurisdictions room. We could walk into the room and we could quickly adapt with whatever materials we had at our fingertips. And as you can see in this comic strip, adapting online while presenting virtually is not nearly as easy. And often, if you're not prepared, you might end up having a meeting that is unintentionally negatively impacted by the use of technology. And so as facilitators, we have to take great care to perform certain actions before, during, and after our meetings in order to create the right environment for really good data dialogue. And so even though the content of what we're discussing is the same as before the world changed, the way we do it has to be very different. And so today we're going to talk about technology considerations for you to think about before, during, and after your virtual stakeholder meetings. Next slide, please.
And so this webinar is focusing on preparing for your next stakeholder meeting. Even though we are in a remote work environment, everything is running fast and furious. The topic of today's webinar is how to effectively plan and facilitate meaningful engagement, including data discussions, during your next virtual stakeholder meeting. And I just want to take a second to say stakeholders or stakeholder groups could be your interagency coordinating councils or early childhood councils, local agencies or LEA groups, as well as governor boards that are focused on early childhood or special education. So just trying to put some context into this. By participating in this webinar, you will be able to learn how to consider technology when planning a virtual stakeholder meeting, identify common platform features that support facilitation of effective data discussions during your virtual stakeholder meeting, and learn how to leverage technology to promote meaningful engagement after the stakeholder meeting. Now we will discuss items to consider before planning your virtual stakeholder meeting. We have another poll with a few more questions. As you can see, we have you organize the list of tasks to do before the meeting. Do you practice using technology before the meeting? And have you ever identified a team member to support your virtual meeting? Renee, how are we doing on the responses?
We have about 40 responses, about 66%.
Okay, give a few more seconds. Okay, Renee, what are we showing as far as results? Have you organized the list of tasks to do before the meeting? 84% said yes. Do you practice using technology before the meeting? 86% said yes. Have you ever identified a team member to support your virtual meetings? 86% said yes as well. So that's great. Everybody's thinking about planning and preparing for virtual meetings. I'm sure by now many, if not all of us, have realized that carrying out a virtual meeting is a lot different than carrying out or preparing for in-person meetings. Again, thank you for your participation. The planning of stakeholder meetings in our all-remote work environment requires slightly different planning. Intentional and well-planned communication will guarantee that all participants have important logistical information and are able to participate in your virtual meeting. Everyone knows that meeting logistics and information must be communicated before the meeting. However, the virtual setting requires consideration around how you will share login information, disseminate pre-work, plan a realistic agenda, ensure universal access for families, which includes transcription and interpreters, sharing meeting documents and handouts, and collecting required information.
So in order,
turn it over to you.
oh, go ahead. So, oh, sorry about that, Tony. So in order for us to do this effectively, we have to really understand this concept of a technology ecosystem. And it requires us to really think through where we're going to meet. And so stakeholder groups, as Tony said earlier, can really comprise any set of people or team that you're working with. And a lot of us have organizational platforms that we use. And so depending on your organization and the platforms that you have access to, you really do want to determine ahead of time where you want your meetings not only to take place, but in conjunction, if you can have a shared place to hold your meeting, coupled with a shared place to store your documents like Microsoft Teams, things like that might streamline and help your team understand where things are located and have more ease at finding those documents that you'll use frequently during the meeting. Again, depending on how frequently you meet with your team, that will help you to determine whether or not you should identify a shared place to store your documents and have that be the same place where you hold your meeting. So you can see that some platforms allow you to have that shared space to meet as well as store your documents, while others don't. And so you'll see here listed platforms such as Teams, Zoom, and WebEx are all wonderful, and there are so many more that you could add to this list. But you do want to think through how frequently you will be meeting and whether or not it would help to have that meeting place be the same place as where you store your documents. And then the other question to ask and think about in regards to your technology ecosystem is how will you communicate? We're all flooded with email right now. Every single one of us, we're getting tons and tons of email. And so something to consider may be whether or not you want to engage in communication via that platform. So it's just something to think through. The idea that right now, many of us, especially when we think about stakeholders that are family members, and they may not be engaging with technology on a daily basis, like maybe you or I, who are, you know, coming to work every day, we're reporting in online, we're in meetings all day long. We understand this jargon, and we understand a little bit more easily where to go. Think about that in light of your stakeholders, and make sure that you have really clearly defined where you're going to meet, where you're going to store your documents, and how you intend to communicate with your team. And so it's just really important to adequately have those discussions, and then train and prepare every team member and every stakeholder that's engaged in these team meetings to make sure that they understand where you're meeting, where things will be stored, and how to communicate, and that you do this before your first meeting so that everybody feels comfortable when they're logging in for the first time. I don't know about anyone here, but I have certainly been in the position where I could not get into the meeting. And so you really want to consider before your meeting all of those logistics that will help your participants and team members feel more comfortable. You want them to feel as comfortable as possible and very happy and engaged so that they can focus on your data discussions when they log into your meeting. And so considering your meeting logistics in advance will help. All of us, including every stakeholder that you are going to be working with, are very, very busy right now. And so you want to be sure to post your meeting links, any passwords, any codes in multiple locations, such as the meeting invitation at the top of your agenda, or in your community of practice or shared platform like Teams that we discussed, and in any additional place that might be easy for people to find. I have definitely been in situations where I've lost internet connectivity and then have been frantically searching through my email inbox because somebody may have just emailed me a link and it just gets lost in the many hundreds of emails. And so to avoid that feeling of stress and anxiety, make sure that you post your login information in multiple locations. The other thing you want to think through is to provide a call-in phone number, just in case your participants lose internet connectivity. And so you want to make sure your login phone number is in the same exact place as your login, so that everybody knows, and then they grow to expect over time that they'll always be able to find the meeting information at the top of the agenda, as well as in the meeting invite, or whatever other location you and your team find to be most appropriate. You also want to plan proactively for audio issues. Make sure that you have a team member who's identified to support technology and understand the variables that could cause a lot of feedback or echoes. And that can be really uncomfortable. Sometimes people unintentionally sign in more than once or log in twice, and that can cause a lot of feedback. And so I have a question here from Sandy. Can you expand on plan for audio issues? Is there a checklist? As Jen said, we're going to get into those questions towards the end, but you're absolutely right. There are many different audio issues that can happen. And the main to think about immediately would be that echo, that feedback, or like I just experienced this morning, somebody that was facilitating a training, he was using earbuds. And so his system was set up so that his speaker and his earbuds were tied together. And as the presenter, his earbuds died in the middle of the presentation. So all of us on the other end are sitting there like, we could see his mouth moving. 1 minute we could hear, the next minute we couldn't. And it just took a couple of minutes for him to figure out what the issue was. And at this point in time, we all are giving each other a lot of patience and a lot of grace because we are in a really unique and unprecedented time for our work, especially with stakeholders. And so the less you can have that happen, the better it will be for your team, although everybody does understand that these things do happen. The other thing you want to think through before your meeting is to explain participation expectations in your invitation. Make sure that everybody knows that when they enter the meeting, they should be on mute. Again, that helps to decrease audio issues. And it creates a calmer, more peaceful start to your virtual meeting. And the other thing to consider, especially for stakeholders, is that most meetings require a sign-in sheet. So we're not at a table anymore where we can easily pass the sheet around. So be sure to think through how you will collect the attendee signatures for your proof of attendance prior to your meeting starting. A lot of meetings that I've attended or stakeholder meetings that I've been to, people just simply type their names and locations in the chat. And so as a facilitator of the meeting, you can save that chat log and have documentation of your attendees. Another thing that people do often is to have a Google form or a Microsoft Word document, but something that's disseminated before the meeting so that people know where to go to sign in. You just want to make sure you have all of that set and ready to go before your meeting begins. Next slide, please. And so one thing that we all know as well, especially as we're in whatever month of this that we are in, is that meeting fatigue is absolutely real and it is a challenge. When we used to be face-to-face, we could see each other, we could read nonverbal body language, and especially with stakeholder meetings, we might be in a meeting for 3 to 4 hours. And so the ability to see each other and to share coffee or food or just chit-chat during a break, that led to these feelings of camaraderie and team comfort that we just don't have anymore, at least not to the same extent. And so what you want to do is really consider ways that you can build that into your meeting before your meeting starts. We used to be able to just use chart paper, examine data sets on paper and spread information out on the table. And since we also can't do that anymore, you want to think about ways to engage your participants and stakeholders in activities that will allow them to just engage not in a whole group all the time. You also want to make sure that you can get people up and stretching and moving. As we've been doing research about different activities that involve identifying or gathering items, it allows people to get up and move around their house and then come back to the computer. Again, you need to be very intentional when you're planning meetings like this because you don't want to lose a lot of meeting time, but it is really important for people to be able to connect, stand up, stretch, and remember, some people, this might be their last meeting of the day, and they might have been sitting in front of the computer for 8 hours before getting to your stakeholder meeting. So just keep that in mind when you're planning. Something that helps us with shortening the time frame. So before, a stakeholder meeting might have been 4 hours long. Well, you can't have effective 4-hour meetings very frequently using the remote technology. And you want to think about ways to hold shorter meetings that are just as effective. And that means that you might have to plan out and ask your participants to engage in pre-work before the meeting starts. So when communicating pre-work expectations, be sure to explicitly state what your participants need to do before they attend your meeting. And be direct. Tell them exactly what you need them to do, where to go to find it, and how to access the information. So for example, with your technology ecosystem, if you have all of your documents stored in one place and you need your stakeholders to view data ahead of time or read an article ahead of time, you can easily point them back to that one location in order to get access to the pre-work. You also want to make sure that you check permissions of what you are sharing. And I experienced this personally. It was a very difficult situation to manage as a meeting facilitator. I had made these beautiful worksheets or conversation sheets that my teams were going to use. The participants were going to be in breakout rooms. It was all very elaborate. It was all very well planned. And when it came time to execute the activity during the meeting, I didn't realize that my shared document had a locked permission set. And you can imagine the fiasco that created. I lost a good 11 to 12 minutes of my meeting time because I hadn't paid attention to that detail. And so when you're planning pre-work, if you're using shared documents, make sure you check permissions so that people can open them and access them immediately. And the other learning is that if you can, share those documents prior to your meeting starting. This also leads us to really need to think through our agendas. And so carefully consider how you are chunking information so that participants are not sitting passively or listening for way too long. That will definitely help your meeting fatigue. Next slide, please. So with preparing for your data and visualizations, you really want to think about the context that you're sharing the data within, and how you can save time and promote more dialogue during the meeting. So think about it. You don't want your stakeholders to be sitting, if you have 60 minutes, you don't want them to spend 30 minutes of their time reading. You want them to spend most of their time engaged in data dialogue. So share out those summaries of data ahead of time before the meeting so that people can really review them and think through them and identify questions that they might have before your meeting starts. And so, excuse me, this means that you really want to make sure that your data visualizations are easy to read and understand. And you also might think through identifying a point of contact from your organization to be a point of contact that any stakeholder could call or reach out to ask questions in order to understand that data better before they get to the meeting. You want to make sure that you have data charts with language that is clear and avoids jargon so that every single stakeholder understands what they're seeing. And you also need to consider that participants will be engaged in your meeting using different devices. Some of them might be on a cell phone, others might be on an iPad or a computer. And so that really requires us to think through what type of format will be best. And then you might want to take some time to test out what that format looks like via an iPhone versus a laptop. So these are lots of things to think through. Excuse me. Lastly, you want to ensure that any data shared in this meeting or prior to your stakeholder meeting maintains the privacy and confidentiality of all participants and adheres to whatever legal requirements are mandatory for your jurisdiction. Next slide, please. So before your meeting starts, when you're considering your agenda, one thing to think through is that everything takes longer virtually. And so accept this and plan for it accordingly. Really think through and determine your meeting objective. For example, what does your stakeholder group want to know? What do they need to know? And what evaluation questions does the group want to answer? Introductions are really important. However, they might take a really long time. And again, thinking about your agenda, you don't want introductions to take 30 full minutes. If you have a large team that you're working with, think through carefully about different ways that you can engage in an introduction for people to loosen and get to know one another that doesn't always involve the round robin of, my name is, and this is my role, and this is where I'm from. And though that is helpful and important, there are some new and innovative ways, like I know Slido has some really great prompts and questions that get groups going and talking without taking that huge amount of time to really do introductions. You might want to consider using polls or quick surveys to break the ice, and always look to find similarities between your participants and your stakeholders if you're working in a larger group. When you're thinking about organizing your work, be very realistic and mindful about how your timeframes will work and the time segments in which you're working. So you want to make sure that you are using very clear timeframes and stating them clearly in your agenda, as well as scheduling those consistent stretch breaks we talked about during meeting fatigue. Okay. Back to this idea of document sharing, which is really, really important. Be sure to think through what materials you need to share before your meeting and consider why you're sharing and what participants need to do. As we were planning this webinar, Tony and I were thinking through, why do you share documents? And this idea of understanding whether or not your participants need to actually type or engage in the use of the document or the pre-work prior to your meeting and or during the meeting can be a real decision point for you as you're planning your next stakeholder engagement meeting. And so if the answer is yes, and you need your participants to be working in a workbook or answering questions together collectively, then you definitely want to use a shared document system, such as Google Drive, Teams, SharePoint. Again, that list obviously has many other tools that you can add to that list, but those are just a few. If you don't need your participants to be typing collectively or answering questions collectively, you can absolutely use a static document such as Word or PDF. You do want to think about if there is information that you don't want participants to be able to change, then transitioning your document into a PDF is often a really good idea. And then that PDF or that Word document can be stored in the same shared system. Or you can email it, but you can store it in the shared system. Again, with all the emails that we're all receiving, I know that many of us are trying to decrease the number of emails and increase the use of shared platforms. Excuse me. The other thing to think through is prior to your meeting, you might be wanting to share out surveys. And so collecting perception data, any kind of information that, or links to other websites like the DaSy Tool Kit, all of those things could be helpful and could help you increase engagement by pre-work during your stakeholder meeting. Next slide, please. So before you begin, again, all of this work before, it's amazing to me because I did used to engage in many meetings prior to being remote. And it's definitely been a big learning curve to plan and understand the amount of detail you do need to attend to in order to hold a really effective virtual meeting. And when you think about your technology, another reality of this remote work environment is that everyone is at a completely different level of comfort with technology, from the meeting facilitators to the participants. And especially, again, if you have participants or stakeholders who do not engage on a daily basis with this technology, they might feel really uncomfortable. And so you want to consider these multiple factors in order to be sure that your technology runs as smoothly as possible. And so think through who you can have at your meeting to support you during the meeting. You want to be able to test your comfort level with each of the platform features and think through how will you maintain your technology to ensure that everything runs as smoothly as possible. And in order to feel comfortable with this technology, I know I have learned over time that you need to practice, practice, and never stop practicing. Running your meeting virtually requires that you really understand not only how to use your technology, but how to troubleshoot in case one of your participants is stuck or not able to log on. So you really want to make sure if the bulk of your responsibility is to ensure that the message of the meeting actually gets across and that people can engage in dialogue and have a very effective meeting, then you need to have somebody identified on hand who can help you troubleshoot technology. So we recommend that you form a team to support meeting facilitation. We had Jen begin our meeting today, who is our, our moderator, and she and two of our team members are looking at the chat and responding, because as the presenter or the main speaker, I can't do all of those things very well. And so presenting virtually is challenging, and for many reasons. Make sure to reach out to your colleagues and get help so that you, as the main presenter, can actually engage at a very confident level in the meeting discussion and the data that you are reviewing and the dialogue that your team needs to have. You don't want to be responsible for all aspects of the virtual meeting. And so it helps to have the support of a chat monitor, a colleague who can be a facilitator, somebody to help you with those technical glitches that might happen, and also to really have a backup presenter identified. Now, none of us hopes that this would ever happen, but there are cases, especially today, where many of us have our own children that are working in other rooms, doing homework, doing assignments, or family members that might not be well or sick due to the unprecedented nature and environment that we're in. You want to make sure that you have a colleague who can be your backup. Because in the event that an emergency does happen, you want your meeting to go on. The more consistent we can be, the better. And I love how earlier in the chat, I saw one of the participants say, this absolutely has to be a team effort. And I know I cannot reiterate that any more clearly. So thank you for putting that in the chat. The more that you and your team practice using the platform and technologies before the meeting, the better your meeting will go. And so we always encourage teams to set up platforms a few days ahead of time, hold a practice run, and troubleshoot together. Talk through how you'll handle certain situations if they arise. One of the things that one of my coworkers does so beautifully is she sets up alias accounts. And so she will log into the meeting on her iPhone as an alias account, but it allows us to see what the perspective looks like from an iPhone. If she hadn't done that, I would never have a clue what a person engaging in a meeting using an iPhone would look like. And so that is something really helpful to think about doing. The other piece that a tech support member can do is to really be on the lookout for people that might be arriving late to let them in, especially if you have a waiting room set up. Excuse me. And lastly, make sure that you close all of your applications, like your email, anything that might pop up at the bottom of your screen. If you're sharing your screen, you want to minimize those distractions as much as possible before you start your stakeholder meeting. Okay, next slide, please, Renee. And then lastly, the last thing to think through before the meeting is to identify a facilitator. Find a trusted colleague who you know will have your back during the whole meeting and can help you open the meeting, can remind everybody of the agenda, can review those meeting logistics, and can really help with the muting, the unmuting, the chat monitoring, and help smooth that participant check-in process. We did find a really good resource called From Working During COVID-19, How to Be Good at Video Meetings. And we're finding more and more that there are excellent resources available for all of us at our fingertips online. So that's lots to think through before your meeting starts. And I'm gonna pass the baton back over to Tony, who's gonna talk to us about what to do during your stakeholder meeting.
Thank you, Andrea. I particularly love the tip about having the alias to be able to practice and try things out. What a wonderful idea. So now that we have reviewed the many steps to take before your meetings, let's discuss how to leverage technology during your meeting. Before we move any further, we do have another poll question for you. Do you routinely remind participants where the login and phone number for the meeting are posted? Do you routinely address housekeeping issues at the beginning of the meeting? And Renee, how are we doing on responses?
We have about 37, so about, well, 60% have responded so far.
Okay. A few more seconds. Okay, Renee, what do we have for results? Do you routinely remind participants where the login and phone number for the meeting are posted? 61%. Do you routinely address housekeeping issues at the beginning of the meeting? So thinking about do you routinely address housekeeping issues at the beginning of the meeting is 90%. So thinking back to what Andrea was talking about, and if you could enter in the chat, what do you do to prepare, what do you do before the meeting to help prepare your stakeholders getting together and working on their data analysis or data topics? And while people are thinking about it and entering, we can move on. Wonderful. Jennifer Story says that she sends the agenda and resources that will be covered. Excellent. Thank you. So time is precious and there isn't a minute to waste. Taking 5 minutes to address housekeeping items at the beginning of your session will save you time for data discussions. Common housekeeping items include technology, making sure participants are muted upon entering the meeting. This eliminates distracting noises and creates a sense of order. Remind participants where the login and phone number for the meeting are posted in case they lose connectivity. Confirm that all participants can see and hear before you officially start the meeting. And confirm that any attendees participating via phone can hear. Review logistics. Review the meeting agenda and include clear time frames for each topic of discussion. Let participants know when breaks are scheduled, especially for meetings over 1 hour. And keep in mind, too, to be flexible with breaks. If your meetings are going to be 2, 3, or even 4 hours long, because sometimes there may be annual. For example, there are annual standing meetings that could be a day and a half. So we want to make sure that our breaks are flexible to make sure our participants, our stakeholders are engaged and refreshed to be able to participate meaningfully in the meeting. Many participants are juggling school for their children, their family responsibilities, and work due to the pandemic. So it's important to keep those breaks in mind. Confirm that participants can see and hear before the discussion begins. Communicate your process for coming to consensus before data discussion starts to promote collaborative decision-making. Example of this could be using the chat function, or if everybody is showing their video, to ask participants to vote 1 for strongly disagree, 3 for agree, or 5 for strongly agree. It's important to know how people are feeling or what their thoughts are around, for example, the interpretation of the data. So if there are varying perspectives, it's good to have those discussions. That way it allows for that communication to help determine what will be the action steps resulting from the analysis. So that is being able to plan the best way possible for making decisions for a program or policy. Review any documents and directions for small group work in breakout rooms prior to sending participants to the breakout rooms. This is key because we don't want to show everyone in a breakout room a handout for the first time as we enter those smaller group discussions. So having the directions and what the handout, for example, looks like as the larger group is still together will be key for people to be able to ask questions, and it helps to bring everyone on the same page prior to going into the smaller group breakout. And structure the breakout room by asking the group to identify roles such as facilitator, recorder, and timekeeper. It'll help to keep the pace and help to keep people engaged. So, for example, assigning a facilitator can help to keep the conversation moving. Having a timekeeper to make sure that everybody is able to speak during this allotted time. And another key aspect of the timekeeper is being able to provide a 1 minute or 2 minute warning or a 5 minute warning as to when or advance notification as to when the breakout room will go back into the larger group room so people are prepared. And also assigning somebody to report out. You don't want to go back to the large group and not having identified somebody, because there will be a lot of hemming and hawing in terms of who should report out, or maybe not quite knowing what to report out on. Welcome participants, introducing participants creatively. For example, as Andrea mentioned earlier, having icebreakers and keeping in mind the time and the number of people that are in the session. That'll help drive your decision in terms of how that introduction or icebreaker activity should look. Gather sign-in information at the beginning of the meeting. The chat function may be used for this, as well as shared documents or forms that Andrea addressed earlier. And include polls and surveys along the way to keep participants engaged. Virtual meetings are paced differently. We are all finding that out, especially now. Maximizing your meeting time by planning carefully is key in terms of determining your steps to review the data, to interpret the data, coming to consensus on decisions, and identifying next steps. Remember that it will be more difficult to assess participant engagement if you're sharing your screen and cannot view everyone's faces. So know your participants' names, ask direct questions, and check in frequently to confirm engagement around these areas for dialogue around what we're seeing in terms of the data. The Data Meeting Toolkit was developed by the IDEA Data Center, also known as IDC. The toolkit provides a suite of tools that guide conversation around data and support database decision-making. The toolkit provides resources to support success before, during, and after data meetings, including a description of essential data meeting roles and responsibilities, including key stakeholders. When it comes to key stakeholders, please keep in mind families and communities for whom many times the data is about. So we absolutely want to get their input. Does the data ring true? And hear the stories that go with the data as well. A protocol of steps before, during, and after meetings to guide selection analysis and decision making. And it also has examples of how to use the toolkit. When it comes to key roles and responsibilities, we have the protocol lead who determines the objective and the data to use. They identify participants and key responsibility, organize the data to present, and prepare and distributes the agenda before the meeting, so allowing for an opportunity to review beforehand to be ready for those discussions. The protocol lead may act as the facilitator or may choose to identify another individual as the facilitator so the lead can attend the meeting as a participant and listen. And after the meeting, the protocol lead provides stakeholders with a summary of the meeting that includes next steps. The meeting facilitator guides participants in discussing observations based on the presented data, interpretation and implications of the data. They also provide the next steps for the group and reflections on meeting effectiveness. The facilitator can be internal staff or outside support, such as an DaSy or IDC PA provider. Note taker and timekeepers are responsible for capturing the group memory of the data meeting. Ideally, the meeting notes should capture important points and decisions without becoming a verbatim transcript of the meeting. And this takes practice. Note-taking takes practice, and it's efficient and effective when you're able to capture the important points and decisions along the way as you're trying to capture what everybody is saying. The timekeeper is responsible for assisting the facilitator with keeping the meeting on schedule. Using the time frames on the agenda, the timekeeper alerts the group when the time allocated for a particular part of the meeting will soon elapse. And stakeholder participants identifying key stakeholders to participate in the group data analysis is a critical part of ensuring a productive meeting and a desired outcome. Again, this is going back to the team concept. Typically, stakeholders will be active participants in a data meeting without added responsibilities of the roles described above. In this process, the stakeholder is anyone who has a vested interest in the data being analyzed, discussed, used, and acted on in a way of making informed decisions. So the data meeting protocol, it has a before, during, and after component to help prepare for those meetings. It includes stakeholders in data meetings, and it provides examples and templates to work with. So if you could, list in the chat 1 or 2 during tasks that you would like to implement for your stakeholder meetings.
We have a note from Elisa about the idea of timekeeping and having, I think that's referencing having some roles identified for the participants, not just the facilitator, but engaging the participants in those roles.
Excellent, thank you.
Yes, and Elisa also noted that when there was not enough notice for participants going into transition, it was rather shocking. So especially your point about how time is very different in a virtual meeting versus a face-to-face. Everything seems to take 2 or 3 times as longer as we would expect. So having someone really track that time is very helpful.
Exactly, that's a great point. And that being surprised or shocked by that transition happens quite frequently. And a way to work with that is maybe try and wrap up when you see that minute notice or 2-minute notice to start wrapping up, because I think we've all have experienced where it looks like there's a minute left, but next thing you know, everybody's transitioning into a larger room or the meeting has ended.
Mm-hmm. And so there's also some conversation going around in the chat about other apps like Padlet that people have used and found helpful. So we'll keep that conversation going in the chat, and when we get to the Q&A, we can open that up. So if you do have any ideas, please type them in the chat, and we'll reference that at the Q&A session once we wrap up the content for the slides.
Thank you very much for your great points and suggestions. So on our next slide, we'll talk a little bit about after the meeting. we do have a poll for you. And that is, do you inform participants of the next steps at the end of the meeting? And Renee, how are we looking on responses?
Well, we have about 50% that have voted, 33, 34 participants.
And what do the results look like? Great, 97% of you say that you inform participants of the next steps at the end of the meeting. Even though the meeting is over, we all know there is more to do. The notes from the stakeholder meeting should include specific information such as what tasks must be completed, when the tasks are due, and who is responsible. A draft of the notes should be shared with the state clients and TA provider team to review and for potential revisions, and that's to make sure thoughts and ideas were captured correctly and that everyone is on the same page in terms of what they heard during the course of the meeting. If there are changes, then the notes can be finalized and distributed to the state clients and stakeholders. Identifying a shared digital space helps the team save time locating documents and notes. And again, Andrea covered a lot of those earlier on. So in the chat, if you could list one or two after tasks that you have implemented for your stakeholder meeting, or list in the chat one or two after tasks that you would like to implement.
I don't see anything coming through in the chat, Tony. Oh, here we go. Okay, so Cindy says, at the end of the meeting, we ask stakeholders what they will take back to their respective agencies as next steps. So not only what are our next steps with this group, but what are your next steps going to be? So that's great. Barbara Simpson says, sending out the meeting notes and reminders about next steps, debrief meetings with other staff involved in the meeting. Yes, the debrief meetings are great things to consider scheduling. Reminders about when the next meeting will be. I learned to be more specific with notes after meetings, really including dates, persons responsible. Alice says that she's asked people to list the top 3 priorities that have come out of the meeting. And then Elisa also mentioned a doodle poll for follow-up one-on-one meetings. And sending out a summary of the meeting afterwards to all stakeholders. This is another idea that Brenda typed in the chat. So lots of great ideas in the chat.
Yes, thank you, Jen, and thank you everyone for submitting your ideas. And as we move on, we are ready to wrap up. Write something new that you learned in the chat box. So we've been hearing a lot of great ideas along the way, and just even a few seconds ago. If you would like to share one action that resonated with you for before, during, or after the meeting, you can raise your hand. We'd love to hear from you. Or if you have any clarifying questions. We do want to ask that you remember to complete the evaluation survey. This is important for us because we base our work on feedback from you.
So I have a few comments in the chat related to using tools like Padlet. We had lots of good ideas that Participants have shared in the chat related to some of the different apps that they found successful in sharing and collaborating. And then Suzanne mentioned practicing before and teamwork being so important. And that in order to make this really work, it's a team effort, not just a one person show. Liz mentioned, I will take away the idea of putting the login information in multiple places, ensuring that just because I included it in an invite doesn't mean they have it. Absolutely, great point. I like the use of wrap for wrap up. So that's great. So Andrew, I don't know if you want to speak to that at all about where this comes from.
Absolutely. So wrap up is part of a team-based cycle of instruction that we developed at Johns Hopkins University School of Education at the Center for Technology and Education. This is one of 6 phases of instruction that we often use when we are engaging and doing presentations. We have used TBCI, team-based instruction cycle, for students that are in preschool all the way through graduate students, through national presentations. And it's amazing how it quickly just sums up your meeting. And of course, it's an acronym, so you can use this and you can play around with the W, the R, the A, the P. We also have a very easy way of launching a presentation, which we often use, which is called the setup. So it's the same thing, S-E-T, and you obviously pick a letter that starts with S and start your sentence that way. But really anything that creates consistency. Especially in this virtual world, we have found that consistency and people really knowing what to expect is extremely helpful. And even as we were all working together to develop this as a team, we really tried to practice what we preach, because we can't do it alone. And it's amazing to look at how iterative this whole process really truly is. And as we are in this remote work environment, how we need to be patient and understanding, but also working so that each time we meet, our meetings become better, they become more effective. And then we learn to laugh at the mistakes we made last time. But really to keep the spirit of the work in our hearts and just, keep trying each time we get together.
Okay, so I think we're going to move on to the A of wrap up, to ask any remaining or clarifying questions. And I can go back earlier in the chat to refer to one of the questions that came through related to how do you deal with document sharing when not everyone might have the same organizational permissions? So that was something that was brought up in the chat. For example, Microsoft Teams is an organizational permission based, but if they have stakeholder meetings with people outside of the organization, how might something like that work?
Well, I know one thing that we have learned working with different teams that are all over the place geographically is that often your organization's platform would have permissions to allow you to invite guests. So I know our organization uses Teams, and we are able to work with people in different countries that don't have Teams, and we have invited them as guests. So check out, depending on the organization that you're with, check out what platform you use. And I've always learned too that if I just reach out to our IT team, if I'm not sure of something, a lot of times our IT department will really be able to help me understand how to either adjust a setting or troubleshoot something that I might not know. But typically, there are features that allow guests to be invited. And if any of my other team members on this call have feedback, please feel free to chime in on that.
The last comment that has come through in the chat has to do with the acknowledgement that meetings take longer in virtual environments, so we may have to do a little less, and that sometimes less is more in the planning. And then we also have some communication about interest related to posting the list of apps that we would recommend. And there was some conversation also in the chat related to the accessibility of some of those external apps that people have used. So that's something that we can follow up and provide an additional resource for the participants of the webinar today related to those questions. So the final thing that's come through is anyone who uses Teams, have you been able to use breakout rooms with guests?
I have not. Yeah, I have not been able to use breakout rooms with guests in Teams. And that's, again, where you really have to think through. We actually just had this discussion today, Jen, and realizing, you know, we can't use Teams for this. Typically, we do use Teams. But if you do have to use two platforms, if Teams is where you're communicating and you might need to use maybe Zoom as a platform for your meeting because you want to have multiple breakout rooms, you can set that up and share it within Teams and really think through strategically how you're communicating the use of Zoom within the meeting. So I don't know if anyone else has thoughts or wants to share on that.
I haven't tried it, but I did see a YouTube video, and I'll try to locate it while we're still all here, that talked about creating channels within Teams and using the channels as your breakout room. But like I said, I haven't tried it myself because generally in those situations we use Zoom if we need a breakout room. But I'll try to find that YouTube and post it in the chat.
Thank you, Cecilia. That is really helpful. I could see how that would work as somebody who uses Teams, but for somebody that's new to Teams, that would be a little bit complicated initially, maybe. I think the big takeaway is really the amount of thinking through that we have to do prior to all of these meetings, and then really practicing and rolling our sleeves up and getting into these tools before we facilitate our meetings to make sure that they go smoothly.
And I think Suzanne Perry in Arizona, her point she makes is that meetings take longer in virtual environment, so we may have to do a little less. And that's part of the reason why we're talking about this today. So if you have for example, a meeting that may be 4 hours long or a day-long meeting that you typically have, and you have to think of what goes in, you have to think about the before, during, and after, because it'll be a lot different, and you don't want to get into that area where you're trying to take on too much in a virtual meeting, because what you are used to doing in person, it's not going to equate to what you can do virtually. So it's important that you're able to break out maybe chunks of information in terms of being able to have your to still have the meeting that you're used to having, but it will look different. But you can still accomplish the same goal with a different approach and way of thinking.
And we did have a comment come through and a question come through related to the wrap-up slide again. So the question was, is there something similar to wrap-up available in Spanish?
I was actually just sending a quick message to Anna Maria. You can use wrap-up, honestly, however you would see fit. You could feel free to write the sentence in Spanish. We don't have this specifically translated, but it's literally, you would take the W, R, A, and P, and then we literally will get online and brainstorm words that start with W sometimes to think through what's the best sentence to help wrap this up. And so you just want to look for words that start with W, words that start with R, words that start with A, and words that start with P. So you could technically do that in any language. So feel free to use it and do it.
All right, so that's all the activity that I see coming through in the chat at this time. And we said that we wanted to provide you the overview of the content about preparing for your next virtual stakeholder meeting, but we wanted to offer an optional time for the next 20 minutes If anybody does want to stay on and you have more specific individual questions that you'd like to hang on and talk with Andrea and Tony about, you're invited to stay on for this optional time. Otherwise, we really appreciate your participation and your engagement. Thank you so much for all of the activity that you've posted in the chat. We'll make sure to, this has been recorded, so this will be posted for all of the registrants, and we will start working on getting together a list of some of those apps that we mentioned, that people in the chat box have also mentioned that have been helpful to engaging in these virtual stakeholder meetings. So thank you so much, and please remember to complete the evaluation survey and have a great rest of your day. And thank you to Andrea and Tony for the wonderful presentation. We appreciate all of your expertise in this area. Bye, everyone. Feel free to hang on if you would like have some more specific questions.
And thank you for facilitating, Jen.
Team effort, right, Andrea?
Yes.
So it looks like our group has dwindled, but we still have a few people on the line. So does anybody on the line have any specific questions that they'd like to unmute themselves and or type in the chat and ask Tony or Andrea?
Oh, nice. Thank you. Thank you, Marcia. I'm going to download that and check it out. It says for peace and anxiety. Oh, still looks good.